The rain fell lightly on the road, that fine rain that doesn't soak you all at once but drenches you little by little like certain sorrows. The black Mercedes cut through the road with the smoothness of someone who is in no hurry because the world waits. In the back seat, Ricardo Monteiro adjusted the cuffs of his shirt under his dark jacket while watching the drops break on the windowpane. He was 52 years old, with graying hair at the temples, hands that had never needed to hold anything for very long, and a silence in his chest that no board meeting could fill. It had been 6 months since Beatriz, his wife, had left. Not for another man, not for another city. Beatriz had died on a Sunday morning, between coffee and the newspaper, from an aneurysm no one knew existed. She fell with the cup still in her hand. Ricardo heard the sound of the porcelain against the marble floor and thought it was just that, a broken cup. When he got to the kitchen, the coffee was spread across the white floor like a dark stain he would never be able to clean. Since then, the mansion in Nova Lima had become too big. The rooms had no echo, but they had emptiness, and emptiness sometimes makes more noise than any scream. Ricardo started sleeping on the same side of the bed all the time, because turning to the other side was admitting that no one else was there anymore. He kept her perfumes on the bathroom counter. Sometimes he would open the jar just to smell them and then feel ashamed of himself, as if it were a weakness to remember. The driver slowed down. There was a stretch of road under construction, orange cones scattered across the road like clumsy little soldiers. The traffic squeezed the cars into a slow flow, and it was in this dragging of vehicles, in this stumbling of the road, that Ricardo saw it. On the right side, walking along the dirt shoulder, a woman carried a white plastic bag in one hand and held a bent umbrella in the other. She wore a flowered dress that had faded from so much sun and washing, and low-heeled shoes with worn soles at the heels. Her shoulders were hunched forward, not of tired, but in that kind of tiredness that people experience when they try to take up less space in the world. Ricardo knew those shoulders. He knew that way of walking. He knew the gesture of running his hand through his hair to tuck it behind his ear, even when it didn't need to be tucked away. "Stop the car," he said, and his voice came out more urgent than he intended. The driver glanced in the rearview mirror with an expression that suggested his boss had lost his mind. "Pull over there in front. Now." The Mercedes pulled over to the side of the road, and Ricardo got out before the car came to a complete stop. The light rain touched his face, and he didn't even notice. He walked back a few meters, his 3,000 real jacket getting splattered with mud, and stopped 5 steps from her. "Dona Lourdes?" The woman raised her eyes. They were deep, dark brown eyes, the kind that hold much without ever spilling. She blinked slowly, as if trying to adjust the image to her memory. Then her mouth opened slightly, not to speak, but in pure surprise. The kind of surprise that comes before words. "Mr. Ricardo?" They stood there, frozen on the edge of that gray road, amidst the noise of the trucks and the smell of wet asphalt, looking at each other as if rediscovering a face they thought they had invented. Lourdes de Fatima Mendes had worked in the Monteiro household for 14 years. She started when she was in her early 30s, still with her young daughter in her arms, recommended by Dona Eloisa, Beatriz's mother, who said, "This one is trustworthy, serious, and cooks like an angel." Beatriz liked her from the first day. Ricardo took longer, not out of distrust, but Ricardo took his time with anything that involved looking into another person's eyes. Lourdes was discreet, the kind of person who stood out precisely because she didn't want to be noticed. She would make coffee before anyone asked. She would put flowers on the living room table when the house was feeling down. She knew the temperament of each room. She knew the library needed silence. The kitchen required soft music. The master bedroom needed lavender on Beatriz's pillow and mint on Ricardo's. She didn't just clean the house, she took care of it. There's a difference that only those who have lived on both sides understand. Ricardo remembered isolated episodes, as if his memory retained only fragments of her kindness. The time he returned from a trip and found his office reorganized, but with all the papers in the same place. She had only cleaned around the things, respecting his disarray as if it were sacred. The time his son Tomas, at 15, had a crying fit because of a girlfriend, and it was Lourdes who sat with him on the back stairs, saying nothing, just present. When Ricardo asked her what she had said to the boy, Lourdes replied, "Nothing, Mr. Ricardo. Sometimes we just need someone to stay." She stayed for 14 years, and then, as quietly as possible, she left. It was Beatriz who delivered the news. On a Tuesday in April, while they were having dinner, she said that Lourdes had asked to leave. Her daughter was ill, something serious, something that required full-time care. Lourdes thanked her for the years of work, refused the extra money Beatriz tried to offer, and left with a bag and a dignity that wouldn't fit in any car. Ricardo nodded that night, chewing the rice that someone else had prepared, and which didn't have the same seasoning. He didn't ask anything else. She didn't call to find out how her daughter was. You didn't send a message. The truth is that Ricardo, at that time, was still the type who confused employees with cogs in a machine, working parts. They are there while they are present and are replaced when they leave. He wasn't cruel. He was just blind in that common way among people who never needed to see. Now, 8 years later, under the light rain of the BR 381 highway, he looked at Lourdes and saw all the things he hadn't seen before. She was thinner. Her face had lines that weren't there when he left. Her hands, which always carried something, a pot, a broom, a cloth, a child, now carried a shopping bag and an umbrella that barely covered her. But her eyes were the same. Those eyes that knew how to stay. "Are you all right, ma'am? What are you doing here on the road?" Lourdes smiled. It wasn't a smile of joy. It was the smile of someone who had learned that certain questions don't require truthful answers. "I'm coming back from the city, Mr. Ricardo. I went to pick up some medicine." "Walking?" "The bus didn't come today. They said it broke down." Ricardo looked at her feet. Her shoes were soaked. He calculated the distance. From the center of Quete to where they were, it was at least 10 kilometers on foot. "Get in the car, Mrs. Lourdes. I'll take you." She hesitated. She looked at the Mercedes, at the uniformed driver, at Ricardo's rain-stained jacket, and then at herself. Her faded dress, her wet shoes, her plastic bag. That brief moment of hesitation contained the whole story of someone who always knew which side of the world she belonged to. "No need, Ricardo. I'm almost there, Mrs. Lourdes." He took a step closer. "It's not a favor. It's the least he could do." She looked at him in a way he couldn't interpret. Then she nodded slowly, put away her umbrella, and got into the car with the care of someone treading on someone else's ground. The drive to Lourdes' house took 23 minutes. She lived in a remote neighborhood, where the streets were unpaved and the houses huddled together as if needing support to stand. She gave directions in a low voice. "Turn here, go straight, it's past the church." And Ricardo obeyed silently, feeling that each turn led him to a place he must have known before. When the car stopped in front of a small house with peeling blue walls and a rusty iron gate, Ricardo felt something in his chest that wasn't pity. It was shame, a lukewarm shame, the kind that doesn't scream, just stays there, weighing you down. "It's here," said Lourdes, already with her hand on the door. "Mrs. Lourdes, how is your daughter?" She stopped. She stood motionless for a few seconds, as if the question needed time to find the right answer. Raquel passed away. Ricardo. "It's been 2 years." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of everything Ricardo hadn't asked in 8 years. Lourdes' daughter, the little girl he'd seen running through the kitchen, who called her mother Mommy with such a sweet accent it seemed invented, had died. And he didn't know. He didn't know because he hadn't bothered to find out. "I'm so sorry," he said. And for the first time in his life he realized how small that phrase is compared to certain pains. Lourdes nodded. "We feel it, don't we, Ricardo? A little bit every day, but we get through it." She opened the door and got out with that simple elegance of someone who doesn't need anyone to hold the door for her. Before closing it, she bent down to look inside the car and said, "Thank you for the ride, and my condolences for Mrs. Beatrice, I heard." Ricardo swallowed hard. "Did the lady know? I prayed a lot for her. And for you, sir." The iron gate creaked as she entered. The car remained parked there longer than it should have. The driver said nothing. Ricardo stared at the blue house until the living room light came on from within, and that little yellow square in the window seemed like the warmest thing in the world. Richard didn't sleep that night. He sat in his dark office with a glass of undrinked whiskey and his cell phone in his hand. He searched for Lourdes' name in his old contacts and found a number that probably no longer existed. He didn't call. He stayed there, listening to the silence of the mansion, and began to do something he had never done before. Recount the years. 14 years. Lourdes stayed in that house for 14 years. She arrived at 6 in the morning and left at 7 at night. She knew everyone's schedules, everyone's quirks, everyone's fears. She knew that Ricardo didn't like pumpkin, but never complained when she made soup, so she simply never made pumpkin soup. She knew that Beatrice cried in secret when she argued with her mother. She knew that Tomas kept the drawings he made for his girlfriend under his mattress. She knew everything and told nothing. That silence wasn't submission, it was respect. And what did Ricardo know about her? That her name was Lourdes, that she had a daughter, that she cooked well, that she was trustworthy. 4 pieces of information in 14 years. It was less than he knew about the make of his car. The shame returned, now stronger than ever. It wasn't the shame of having done something wrong. It was the shame of having done nothing. The next day, Ricardo returned. Without the driver, without the Mercedes, he rented a regular car, a silver Onyx that felt strange under his hands accustomed to a leather steering wheel, and drove to the Lourdes neighborhood. He took a basket with bread, cheese, and fruit because he didn't know what to bring and because food is the language of those who can't find words. He knocked on the gate. He waited. He heard shuffling footsteps inside, then the sound of the lock. Lourdes opened the door and stared at him with the same expression as someone who opens the door and finds rain when expecting sunshine. "Mr. Ricardo, did something happen?" "No, Mrs. Lourdes. I just came to see how you're doing." She looked at the basket. She looked at him. She looked at the ordinary car parked on the dirt road. Then she opened the gate a little more and said, in that voice he remembered from so many mornings, "Come in then, the coffee's ready." The house was small but tidy with a care that revealed character. There was a crocheted tablecloth on the kitchen table, a vase with plastic daisies on the windowsill, the only flowers that last forever, Ricardo thought, and a framed photo of Raquel on the living room shelf. In the photo, the girl was smiling. She must have been about 20 years old then. She had the same eyes as her mother. Ricardo sat in the chair Lourdes indicated and accepted the coffee. It was strong, full-bodied, with a touch of cinnamon he hadn't smelled since she had left his house. He took the first sip, and a part of him went back in time, back to the mornings when he woke up to that smell coming from the stairs, to the Sundays when Beatrice asked for cornbread and Lourdes made two just to be sure. "This coffee," he murmured, looking at the cup. "It's the same as always, Ricardo." "I know. That's what scares me." Lourdes sat in the chair opposite, cup in hand, and remained silent. It wasn't an awkward silence. It was a silence that recognized her company. Ricardo noticed she wasn't asking why he was there, as if she knew that some visits don't need justification, they just need to happen. He was the one who spoke first. "Tell me about Raquel." Lourdes' eyes filled slowly, like a river rising without haste. She didn't cry. She took a deep breath, ran her hand over the crocheted towel as if smoothing a memory, and began to speak. Raquel had been diagnosed with leukemia at 18, shortly after passing the entrance exam for nursing school. A painful irony. The girl who wanted to care for others needed to be cared for herself. Lourdes gave up everything. 14 years at the Monteiro's house, her savings, her routine, the dignity of a steady salary. She gave it all up, as if opening her hand to grasp something more important. The following years were filled with hospitals, chemotherapy, sleepless nights, whispered prayers, and that stubborn hope that mothers carry even when doctors have stopped promising. Raquel fought. 6 years of fighting. She had improvements, she had relapses, she had days when she laughed and days when she couldn't open her eyes. Lourdes never left her side. She worked as a cleaner in 3 different places to pay for what the public health system didn't cover. She slept in hospital chairs, she lost weight without realizing it, she grew old without complaining. One day in September, Raquel held her mother's hand and said, "Mommy, I'm tired." Lourdes replied, "Then rest, my love." Raquel closed her eyes and never opened them again. When Lourdes finished telling the story, the coffee was already cold in both cups. Ricardo hadn't moved. He felt something breaking inside him. Not out of sadness, but out of awareness. It was like looking at a painting that had always hung on the wall and only now seeing what it truly depicted. "Mrs. Lourdes, in all these years, you never asked for help." "Ask whom, Mr. Ricardo?" The question held no accusation. It held no bitterness. It was simply the realization of someone who knows that certain doors were never open, and it was precisely the absence of anger that hurt Ricardo the most. If she had screamed, he would have known how to respond. But that peace in the face of abandonment was unbearable. Ricardo returned the next day, and the next, and the next. At first, Lourdes was suspicious. Not suspicious of him, but suspicious of the situation, like someone looking at a gift and expecting to find a flaw. She kept the door open and the coffee ready. But there was something in the back of her eyes that said, "I know this will end." Ricardo promised nothing. He had learned that promises are the most inflated currency in the world. The more you distribute them, the less they are worth. So he simply showed up. He parked his car on the dirt road, knocked on the gate, sat in the kitchen chair, and stayed. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they were silent. Sometimes he brought a newspaper and read while she embroidered. It was a companionship without theater, without a script, without expectations. And that was exactly what they both needed. One afternoon, Lourdes mentioned that she owed 4 months' rent. She mentioned it without asking for anything, as if commenting that it was going to rain. Ricardo paid the debt the next day. When Lourdes found out, she stood in the kitchen doorway, dishcloth in hand, and said, "You shouldn't have done that." "You're right, ma'am. I should have done this a long time ago. I'll pay it back." "No, Mrs. Lourdes, it won't go." They stared at each other. There was something in that look that wasn't gratitude and wasn't charity. It was recognition. 2 people who had lost someone essential and who, somehow, had begun to see in each other a familiar outline, not of what they had lost, but of what they could still find. Weeks turned into months. Ricardo got to know the neighborhood, the neighbors, Lourdes' routine. He met Donna Carmen, who lived next door and took care of 6 grandchildren alone. He met So Agenor, the retiree who repaired radios in his garage and knew the names of all the visible stars. She met the baker who saved an extra loaf of bread for Lourdes when she was running late. He discovered a whole world that had always existed 40 minutes from his mansion and that he had never visited. One day, while helping Lourdes fix a dripping faucet, he, who had never held a pair of pliers in his life, was looked at by her with genuine curiosity and asked, "Why do you keep coming here?" Ricardo wiped his hands on the jeans he now wore for visits, another new habit. as if changing his suit was like changing his skin and thought before answering. Because here I'm just Ricardo. Outside, I'm Monteiro. There's a difference. Lourdes was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Ricardo was always better than Monteiro, he just didn't know it. He didn't answer. But that night, alone in the mansion, he sat on the edge of the bed and cried for the first time since Beatriz died. He didn't cry for Beatriz. He already knew that kind of grief. He cried for all the times he had been blind. He cried for Lourdes, for Raquel. For 14 years of cinnamon coffee, he drank without ever asking how she was. He cried because he discovered that one can live in a 1,000-square-meter house and still not have space for what matters. It was Tomás, Ricardo's son, who noticed first. Tomás was 31 years old, lived in São Paulo, worked in an architecture office, and called his father every 10 days, always with the same question, "How are you, Dad?" And always with the same answer, "I'm fine." But in one of those calls, Ricardo said something different. "I'm going to Caete today." "Caete? What's in Caete?" "Mrs. Lourdes. Do you remember her?" Tomás's silence was the silence of someone who remembers. Of course he remembered. He remembered the woman who sat with him on the stairs when he was 15 and heartbroken. He remembered the smell of the kitchen when she made cheese bread. He remembered her voice calling out, "Tomazinho, come eat before it gets cold." "I remember, Dad. Yes, I remember. She lost her daughter, Tomás, 2 years ago." Tomás came to Belo Horizonte the following weekend, not to visit his father, to visit Lourdes. He entered that small house as if entering a sacred place, hugged Lourdes tightly and said, "You took care of me when I needed it most. I'm sorry I took so long to come back." Lourdes ran her hand over his face and replied, "You've grown, Tomazinho. You've become handsome." His eyes were wet, but his smile was genuine. That afternoon, the three sat in the kitchen. Lourdes made cornbread. Tomás talked about São Paulo, about work, about a new girlfriend. Ricardo listened to his son speak and realized he hadn't heard him like that in years, so relaxed, so free, without the formality they had built between themselves like a glass wall. There was something in that small kitchen, with its crocheted tablecloth and plastic daisies that dissolved the distances. As they were leaving, Tomás grabbed his father's arm at the gate and said softly, "Dad, this woman is special. You know that, right?" Ricardo looked at his son. "I know. I took my time, but I know." The change happened in a way that neither of them planned, as happens with everything that is true. Lourdes began to experience back pain, years of hard work taking their toll. Ricardo took her to an orthopedist, then to a physiotherapist, then to another. She resisted at first. She said she didn't need it, that she had lived with pain her whole life, that pain was just her body complaining about something her soul had already accepted. But Ricardo insisted with that gentle stubbornness that was his, the same stubbornness that made him return to that kitchen every day. And Lourdes went. In the clinic corridors, while waiting for her, Ricardo realized he was no longer there out of obligation, guilt, or loneliness. He was there because a day he didn't see Lourdes was an incomplete day. He was there because her voice saying Mrs. Ricardo was the closest thing to belonging he had known since Beatriz died. He was there because, without warning or permission, he had begun to love that woman. The thought frightened him, not because it was wrong, he was a widower, she was a single woman, but because it seemed impossible. Impossible because of the difference the world would see between them. Impossible because she had been his maid. Impossible because he knew that if he said it aloud, there would be laughter, scorn, judgment at every family lunch, at every business dinner, in every glance from those who judge people by their address and bank account. And that's exactly why he knew it was true. Because love that fears judgment is love that still cares about the audience. And love that faces judgment is love that has found something greater than pride. But Ricardo said nothing. He kept that feeling to himself, like Lourdes kept things to herself, silently, carefully, without haste. She was the first to speak. One Thursday night, after they had dinner together in her kitchen, chicken with okra, fluffy rice, and a farofa that was pure poetry, Lourdes walked him to the gate as she always did. The street was dark with only one working lamppost at the end of the block, and the sky was overflowing with stars, as if compensating for the lack of light below. "Mr. Ricardo, Dona Lourdes, you know that what you're doing, what we're going through, you know that there are people who won't understand, right?" Ricardo looked at her. In the dim light, her face was almost entirely outlined, the line of her forehead, the curve of her nose, her eyes shining in the light from the distant lamppost. He thought of all the meeting rooms where he had negotiated multi-million-dollar contracts. He thought of all the times he had spoken before 50 people without his voice trembling, and he realized that none of those situations required the courage that this moment demanded. "Mrs. Lourdes, I am 52 years old. I lost my wife. I spend my days in an empty house, and the only time I've truly felt alive in the last 6 months was sitting in this kitchen, having coffee with you. If the world doesn't understand that, the problem is the world's. Lourdes remained silent. Then, slowly, as if making a gesture she had rehearsed 1,000 times internally, she reached out and touched his face. Her palm was rough, calloused from years of work, and at the same time, it was the softest thing Ricardo had ever felt. "I don't want you to pity me," she said, and her voice trembled for the first time. "I don't feel sorry for you, Mrs. Lourdes. I admire you. You're the strongest person I know, and the most beautiful." Her eyes filled with tears. This time, the tears fell. Just 2, one from each side, as if they were being counted. "Mr. Ricardo, I am a maid. You are Lourdes. That's all I need to know." He held her hand. They stood there at the rusty gate beneath the stars of Kete, holding hands like 2 teenagers discovering that the world is both immense and too small. Neither of them moved for a long time. There was no need. Some things are resolved in stillness. The world, as Lourdes predicted, did not understand. Ricardo's sister Fernanda was the first to verbalize what others were thinking. "Have you lost your mind, a maid? That's neediness, Ricardo. It's grief. You need a psychologist, not a fling." She didn't finish the sentence, but contempt filled the void. The partners at the firm exchanged glances at business lunches. Beatrice's friends, who used to send messages of condolence, stopped calling. The doorman at the office building, who always smiled at Ricardo, started asking questions he never used to ask, like, "Everything's fine, doctor, everything's all right," as if being with Lourdes were a mess. Ricardo felt the weight. It would be a lie to say he didn't, but there was a difference between feeling the weight and being knocked down by it. And that difference had a name: Lourdes. She never asked him to confront anyone. She never demanded public statements, dinners at expensive restaurants, or appearances at parties. When he told her about his sister's reaction, Lourdes simply said, "She has reason to worry, but she doesn't have reason to belittle me." And then she served coffee as if nothing had happened. That was what brought Ricardo down. Not the world's resistance, but her own. Lourdes resisted without fighting, existed without justifying herself, loved without asking permission. She didn't try to prove anything to anyone, and it was precisely this absence of effort that proved everything. 3 months later, Ricardo made a decision. It wasn't a dramatic decision, the kind announced with background music. It was a decision made early in the morning while having coffee alone in the mansion and realizing it tasted bland. It was a decision born from the simple realization that he no longer lived in that house. He only slept there. He called the real estate agent. He put the mansion up for sale. Not all of it, though. He donated part of the proceeds to the hospital where Raquel was treated, in Lourdes' name, without her knowledge. With the remainder, he bought 2 things: a comfortable apartment in downtown Kete and a new house for Lourdes in the same neighborhood, because he knew that taking her away from Dona Carmem and So Agenor would be like uprooting a tree from the ground where it grew. When Lourdes saw the house, 3 bedrooms, a large kitchen, a backyard with space for a garden, she didn't say anything. She stood in the doorway, looking inside as if gazing at a dream someone had forgotten to bring back to reality. Then she turned to Ricardo and simply asked, "Is there room for a vegetable garden?" He laughed. A genuine laugh, the kind that comes from deep within and takes you by surprise. "Yes, and there's room for everything you want to plant." Lourdes entered the house and went straight to the kitchen. She opened the empty cupboards, ran her hand over the granite countertop, looked out the window overlooking the backyard. Then she rested her forehead against the glass and cried. It wasn't her usual restrained crying. It was a cry that overwhelmed, that cleansed, that swept away years of carrying weight alone. Ricardo stood behind her. He didn't touch her. He didn't say anything. He learned from her that sometimes presence is more than gesture. He stood there, firm, simply someone who stayed. When she turned around, her eyes red and her nose wet, she said in a broken voice, "No one has ever done anything like this for me." So it was time, Mrs. Lourdes. It was definitely time. The months that followed had the texture of new beginnings. They weren't perfect. Ricardo and Lourdes disagreed about small things. He thought the garden needed a landscaper. She thought hands were enough. He wanted to take her traveling. She said the world fit in that neighborhood. He tried to pay for everything. She insisted on sharing what she could. They were gentle frictions, like stones polishing against each other. Ricardo moved into the apartment in Kete. It was a 7-minute walk to Lourdes' house. He would go there every morning for coffee and return every night after dinner. Some nights I would stay. Other nights I would go back to sleep alone because we both understood that building something real also requires the empty spaces between the bricks. He continued working. He didn't sell the companies, he didn't abandon the businesses. But he changed his pace. He delegated more. He traveled less. He started ending meetings at 5 in the afternoon because at 6:30 he had a dinner date with a woman who made chicken with okra better than any Michelin-starred chef. One Friday, Tomas called, "Dad, Juliana and I are coming over this weekend. She wants to meet Dona Lourdes." Juliana was his new girlfriend. When they arrived, Lourdes had already prepared the guest room at Ricardo's house because she took care of his apartment as she took care of her own home, with that instinct of someone who transforms any space into a home. Saturday dinner was at Lourdes' house. Juliana, who was a designer and had grown up in an apartment in Pinheiros, sat in a kitchen chair looking at Lourdes with a kind of admiration that it can be found in an art gallery. When Lourdes served the cornbread, Juliana tasted it and closed her eyes. "Mrs. Lourdes, this is the best cake I've ever eaten in my life. It's my mother's recipe, and my grandmother's. There's no secret, it's just patience." Juliana looked at Tomas. Tomas looked at his father. Ricardo looked at Lourdes. And Lourdes looked at Raquel's photo on the shelf as if silently saying, "See, daughter, everything turned out all right." A year and 4 months after meeting her again on the road, Ricardo proposed to Lourdes. He didn't do it in an expensive restaurant. He didn't buy a diamond ring. He didn't set up surprises with rose petals or hire musicians. He did it on an ordinary Tuesday in her kitchen while she was washing the dishes and he was drying them. He was holding a dish towel, drying a plate that... It was already dry when he said to Mrs. Lourdes, "Will you marry me?" She stopped. She turned off the tap. She looked at him with those eyes that had seen so much and yet could still be amazed. "Are you serious, sir? I have never been more serious in my life. Mr. Ricardo and his family. My family is Tomas, and Tomas loves the lady. The rest is just an audience." Lourdes took off her rubber gloves. She dried her hands on her apron. She stared at him for a while that seemed to contain all the years they had lived apart and all the years they could live together. "I will marry you, Mr. Ricardo, but on one condition." "Which?" "Please stop calling me ma'am." He laughed. She laughed. And that kitchen, with the crocheted tablecloth and the plastic daisies and the photo of Raquel smiling on the shelf, became so full of life that the walls could barely hold it up. The wedding was simple. A registry office, a judge, Tomas and Juliana as witnesses, Dona Carmen and So Agenor in the front row. Lourdes wore a white dress that Juliana helped her choose. Nothing extravagant, just beautiful, just like Lourdes was. Ricardo wore a navy blue suit and new shoes that pinched a little because he insisted on buying them without trying them on. Fernanda, his sister, didn't go. She sent a formal gift and a card wishing him well with the coldness of someone filling out a form. Ricardo put the card in a drawer and didn't think about it anymore. He had already wasted too much time worrying about the opinion of those who didn't care about him. As they left the notary's office, Dona Carmen hugged Lourdes and whispered something in her ear that no one else heard. Lourdes nodded, her eyes shining, and squeezed her neighbor's hand with the strength of someone who thanks her without words. They went to lunch at a simple restaurant, one of those with checkered tablecloths and waiters who call everyone boss. Tomas made a short toast to my father, who finally learned that the best place is where you're happy, and to Dona Lourdes, who taught him that. Ricardo raised his glass, Lourdes raised hers, and between the cold beer and the feijão tropeiro, a traditional Brazilian dish, something was completed, not like a puzzle piece fitting into place, but like a wound that finally stops hurting. In the following months, Ricardo did something that surprised everyone except Lourdes. He created a foundation. He used part of his fortune to build a shelter for single mothers caring for sick children, women like Lourdes, who carry the weight of the world on their shoulders without anyone noticing. The foundation was called Casa Raquel. When Lourdes heard the name, she stood still in the middle of the room, looking at Ricardo as if he had just brought her daughter back. She didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. Some expressions of gratitude are too great to be contained in words and can only be expressed in the way we look at another person. The inauguration was discreet. A banner on the door, a priest who blessed the walls, coffee and cake for the neighbors. Lourdes cut the ribbon with scissors borrowed from her father, Agenor, and for the first time, spoke in front of other people. My daughter Raquel wanted to be a nurse. She wanted to take care of people. She couldn't. But this house will do for her what she wanted to do for the world. Thank you to everyone who believed in her. Her voice didn't tremble. It was firm as a root. And Ricardo, standing beside her, finally understood what strength meant. It wasn't about lifting weights. It was about lifting people. It was about holding pain with one hand and offering hope with the other. It was about being Lourdes. 3 years after that rainy afternoon on BR 381, Ricardo and Lourdes lived in an apartment in Quete. Not in a mansion, not in a penthouse, not in any place that money could make more valuable than it already was. The apartment had 3 bedrooms, a balcony where Lourdes grew herbs in small clay pots, and a kitchen that smelled of cinnamon every morning. Ricardo would wake up at 6 and find the coffee ready. Not because Lourdes was his maid, never again, but because she woke up early by nature, because she liked the silence of the early morning, because the act of preparing coffee was, for her, an act of love that needed no explanation. He would take his first sip, look at her sitting in the chair opposite, and sometimes say, "Good morning, Lourdes," without the Mrs., without the Madam, just her name, and she would reply, "Good morning, Ricardo," without yours, just her name. It wasn't enough, it was everything. Sometimes, at night, when the city grew quiet and the stars appeared in the balcony window, Lourdes would rest her head on Ricardo's shoulder and remain silent. He would put his arm around her and remain silent too. They didn't need to speak. They had already wasted too many words throughout their lives, she silencing what she felt, he saying what didn't matter. Now the silence between them was a whole conversation. One of those nights, Lourdes murmured, "I wonder if Raquel is watching us?" Ricardo tightened his arm around her. If she's there, she's seeing the most incredible mother in the world being happy. And she's smiling. Lourdes closed her eyes. A tear rolled down her cheek, but the smile remained, firm, unwavering. The smile of someone who had crossed the desert and found water. Not water from a mighty river, not water from a spectacular waterfall. Spring water, small, constant, silent. The water that truly quenches thirst. Outside, the city slept. The street lamp at the end of the street remained the only one lit, projecting that circle of yellow light onto the asphalt. The crickets sang their song without an audience. And inside the 3-bedroom apartment, with pots of herbs on the balcony and the scent of cinnamon on the walls, 2 people whom the world had tried to separate by class, by history, by pride, and by silence, were simply together. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was better. It was real. Because fairy tales end when the couple meets. But real life begins afterward, in the repeated breakfasts, the shared silences, the small gestures that no one sees. And it is there, in that invisible afterward, that everything that matters resides. Ricardo found Lourdes on a road in a light rain, walking with a crooked umbrella and the dignity of a queen. And Lourdes found Ricardo lost inside an empty mansion, with everything money can buy and nothing he truly needed. They saved each other, not with grand gestures, with coffee, with presents, with the daily decision to choose to stay. And perhaps that's what love truly is in the end. Not a lightning bolt that splits the sky in two, but a streetlight at the end of the road. Constant, yellow, simple, illuminating the path for those who need to return home.